All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the Fine Art Museums. It's my pleasure to welcome you here for our 11th lecture in the Closer Look series, which we inaugurated to celebrate the centenary of the Legion of Honor last November. For those of you who've been regular attenders, you'll know that the second Saturday of every month since then, we have devoted to different stories about the donors behind the collections, about the collections themselves, even a little bit of intrigue along the way. And the lecture today really is sort of epitomizes what this series, I think, was conceived to do, to really give a closer look. It will be delivered by not one, but two of my colleagues, who will be taking a very close look at our painting, cartoon by François Boucher, Vertumnus and Pomona. And so that we can get straight into it, I'm going to introduce them, then we'll get going. So, Elise Effmann Clifford is the head of paintings conservation at the Fine Arts Museums. She's been here since 2007. Prior to her arrival in San Francisco, she was the assistant conservator of paintings at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth and an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Paintings Conservation at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She received her MA in Art History and a diploma in conservation from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York in 2000, after completing her final year internship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Elise has published on diverse topics such as historical views of Jan van Eyck's painting medium, the rediscovery of a work of Thomas Cole, the materials and techniques of the brothers Linane, the painting medium of the pre-Raphaelite artist John Rodham Spencer Stanhope, and the identification, through technical study, of both the sitter and the painter of a Tudor portrait, recently published in the Burlington magazine. She's been the recipient of major grants from the Getty Conservation Institute and the Kress Foundation, and in 2020 delivered the annual Samuel H. Kress Lecture, Never Assume, Stories of Artistic Idiosyncrasies and Scholarly Biases. And we're all about beating out scholarly biases. Emily A. Beeny is Chief Curator of the Legion of Honor and the Barbara A. Wolfe Curator in charge of European paintings. And I'm delighted that Barbara is with us this afternoon. A specialist in French paintings and drawings of the 17th to 19th centuries, Emily received her PhD from Columbia University with a dissertation on Nicolas Poussin. Before coming to San Francisco, she served as Associate Curator of Drawings at the J. Paul Getty Museum in LA, where her exhibition projects included Manet and Modern Beauty, LA Surprise, Watteau in Los Angeles, and Poussin and the Dance, which was also at the National Gallery in London. She has also held curatorial appointments at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Norton Simon Museum, and currently serves on both the vetting committee for TIFAF Maastricht and the editorial board for the Boletin del Museo del Prado. She is the originating curator of our groundbreaking forthcoming exhibition, Manet and Morisot, which opens in mid-October, and is hard at work on another major international exhibition on the Baroque master Simon Vouet, slated to open in fall 2027. In 2021, Emily was awarded the Prix de rayonnement de la langue et de la littérature française by the Académie Française. So you are in very good hands with both of them. Before I turn the mic over to Emily, I also want to encourage you to join us back here in 1 month on October the 11th for our next A Closer Look lecture, in which Emily will return to provide us with a glimpse into the fascinating relationship between Edouard Manet and Berthe Morisot, the subject of this forthcoming exhibition. But before Manet and Morisot, there was Boucher. So let's get on with the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And enormous thanks to all of you for joining us today. Let's see. At the edge of an overgrown garden, a blushing girl reclines in the arms of an older woman. They're surrounded by nature's bounty. Glistening grapes, velvety peaches, a swollen melon, a basket overflowing with blossom. At left, a statue of Flora, Roman goddess of spring and flowers, stands guard, while two cherubs hover overhead, poised to strike the girl's bare breast with an arrow of love. For the old woman at right is no benign protectress, but Vertumnus, god of fruit and gardens, disguised as an old woman to woo the chaste nymph Pomona. The story of Vertumnus and Pomona is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses and Fasti, mythological poems of time, transformation, and love that offered an endless supply of gallant subjects for both painting and theater in the early modern period. For the subject of this picture has much to do with the theater, and in the complicated life of the canvas on which it's painted, we see a story that unfolds in 3 acts. Tracing this story, recorded, as we shall see, in the picture's physical metamorphoses, our talks this afternoon explore how a subject inspired by the theater became a motif reused and recycled across multiple media, and how an object that began as an accessory to a manufacturing process became an architectural decoration, and ultimately, a beloved gallery picture here at the Legion of Honor. Deinstalled in 2013, François Boucher's Vertumnus and Pomona has been in the Conservation Lab since 2018, the subject of careful study and ministrations by Elise Effmann Clifford and her large expert team, in a multi-year project supported by a grant from the Getty Foundation. The treatment is slated for completion this spring, when the picture will go back on view in our galleries. And today we'll hear more about the treatment and what it's revealed from Elise in just a few moments. My job now is just to set the stage with a few words about the painting's genesis and early provenance. François Boucher, seen here in a pastel portrait by Gustave Lundberg at the Louvre, was the preeminent French artist of his time. Received into the Royal Academy in 1734, appointed general director of the Gobelin Manufactory in 1755, named first painter to Louis XV, and director of the Academy in 1765. Boucher operated a large studio, producing easel pictures, architectural decorations, altarpieces, book illustrations, and for our story, tapestry designs. Among them, the celebrated Fêtes Italiennes and Tentures Chinois, both woven at the Beauvais Manufactory, which served an aristocratic clientele, then operating under the direction of Jean-Baptiste Oudry, whom Boucher would later succeed as director of the Royal Gobelin Manufactory. Among Boucher's greatest supporters was the Marquise de Pompadour, official mistress to the king, seen here in a 1756 portrait by Boucher, today in Munich. Madame de Pompadour was an erudite patron as well as an amateur artist, musician, and dancer, who appeared at Versailles on January 15, 1749, in a revival of the celebrated Ballet des Éléments. First performed in 1721 with a score by de Lalande and des Touches, a libretto by Pierre Charleroi, sets by Oudry, costumes by Claude Gillot, and an 11-year-old Louis XV in a dancing role. This opera ballet comprised 4 acts, corresponding to the 4 elements: air, water, fire, and earth. Each element was represented by an episode from classical mythology or history. For air, there was Ixion, a mortal prince besotted with Juno, queen of the gods. Water was represented by the musician Arion, saved from drowning by the sea god Neptune and his naiads. Fire was represented by Emilia, a Vestal virgin, keeper of the sacred flame, punished for betraying her vow of chastity. And earth was represented by the story of Vertumnus and Pomona. The work underwent multiple productions and revivals over the course of the early 18th century, but the Pompadour's appearance in 1749 was, of course, noteworthy. Dressed in a gown of white taffeta and red satin, decorated with silver lace and garlands of fruit and flowers, she appeared in the fourth act as Pomona, the chaste wood nymph won over by a masked god. The performance inspired various works of art, notably including this sculpture by Jean-Baptiste Lemoine II, in which a Pompadour-esque Pomona draws back in astonishment as Vertumnus removes his disguise. And this painting by Boucher, today in the Columbus Museum of Art, which focuses on a slightly later moment in the story, when Vertumnus has already set aside his mask, poised to reveal his true identity. This painting was originally paired with the picture here at right, evoking the story of Arion from the ballet's second act, Water. Hot on the heels of the 1749 revival production, Boucher received a commission from the Crown to paint 4 pictures representing the elements. He seems to have completed only these 2, for which he received payment in September. They take the horizontal format of over-door decorations, but which royal residence they were intended for remains unclear. By the 1780s, they had left the royal collection and belonged to the great Boucher collector, Bergeret de Grandcourt, in whose posthumous sale they first reappear. The Vertumnus and Pomona composition had, in the meantime, gained some notoriety, reproduced in a sumptuous reversed engraving by Augustin de Saint-Aubin, seen here, which surely served in turn as the model for a delicate enamel painting on the lid of a gold snuff box. This object, today in the Louvre, is emblematic of Boucher's designs, which often lived a long, decorative afterlife, recycled into luxury commodities, from porcelain to upholstery, from watch cases to tapestries. Some produced under Boucher's supervision in the national manufactories at Gobelin and Beauvais, but others devised on the basis of reproductive prints in smaller workshops all across Europe. For Boucher was not simply a painter, but the creator of images and motifs destined to migrate across different media and formats. Which brings us back to our picture, from which we see a detail here at right. The original overdoor painting of Vertumnus and Pomona at lower left also furnished the figure composition for the much larger vertical scene today in our collection. This canvas would have been painted by assistants in Boucher's studio and retouched, like other works of its kind, in this period by the master himself, before being cut into strips and slid under the horizontal low warp looms at Beauvais to guide weavers as they labored over thousands of hours to produce a tapestry. Like this one, woven in reverse from our cartoon, which originally included 2 additional strips, containing the vase and fountain at left and right. This design belonged to a suite of tapestries, a tenture, known as the fragments d'opéra, the operatic fragments, whose other subjects likewise derived from contemporary theatrical productions. Rinaldo's Dream, seen here, shows a scene from Armide, Jean-Baptiste Lully's operatic reimagining of the 16th century epic Jerusalem Delivered. Venus, the Three Graces, and Cupids here at left may have referenced any one of several recent court entertainments, while Issei Asleep at right derives its subject from a pastoral opera by Lamotte and Destouches, revived like the Ballet des Éléments at Versailles in 1749, with Madame de Pompadour herself in the title role of Issei. The set of 4 tapestries, an unusually small tenture for Boucher, was woven in its entirety just once, for the chief comptroller to the king, but individual compositions from the group were sometimes added as a supplement to larger tapestry suites. Vertumnus and Pomona, for example, depicting agricultural demigods, was sometimes appended to the noble pastorals tenture, for which we see 2 large, magnificent cartoons here. Pasted back together after their use at Beauvais, these paintings hang today in the Getty Museum, begging the question of how some cartoons, essentially lavish byproducts of the manufacturing process. Maybe we'll pause for just a moment. Oh, hooray, Wonderful, thank you very much. How some of these managed to survive, while many others obviously perished. A 1794 inventory drawn up at Beauvais lists cartoons for all 4 compositions from the Fragments d'Opéra series, grouped together, but by 1820, Vertumnus and Pomona had been split off from the suite, listed in 4 separate strips with cartoons for the noble pastorals, tonsure. And indeed, it was with a group of other pastoral subjects that our picture would traverse the next century. 2 canvases today in private hands, and one at far right in the Getty Museum in Taiwan. The shared journey of these 4 reconstituted cartoons likely began at a charity auction, a massive sale of tapestries and cartoons mounted by Beauvais in August of 1829. Gallant Rococo subjects had by then fallen badly out of fashion, and the fragmentary scenes may have been scooped up for a song by some enterprising architect or decorator betting on a future Rococo revival. We'll hear more about the reconstitution process in just a moment from Elise. So here I'll just note that in the mid-19th century, when the Rococo revival finally did arrive, the owner of these works essentially Frankensteined each cartoon back together, adding a new strip to the bottom of our canvas to align its figures with those appearing in the other scenes. Rather than stretching these reconstituted canvases over strainers and constructing picture frames for them, the initial owner appears to have tacked them directly into the walls of some grand room where they would have been surrounded by wood moldings, whose scalloped borders took little bites out of the upper corners of all 4 compositions, still evident today. We don't have secure documentation for who this owner was, or the room in which these pictures served their decorative function, though this act in our story more than likely unfolded in Paris, where we have reason to believe that the 4 canvases were displayed as early as the 1860s in the dining room of a grand residence on the Avenue François Ier, belonging to an American expatriate. Stretched over strainers, their scalloped corners squared to fit gilt frames, the 4 canvases made their first documented reappearance at the turn of the 20th century as gallery pictures in the collection of Mrs. Elizabeth Ridgway. A wealthy Philadelphian, then in her 80s, she had resided in the Avenue François Ier for nearly half a century, and she lent Vertumnus and Pomona to a 1902 exhibition at the Guildhall in London, where it was listed in the catalogue, somewhat confusedly, as The Fortune Teller, a beautiful example of Boucher's decorative art. Mrs. Ridgway's daughter, Emily, belonged to a generation of American heiresses whose parents had moved to Europe to marry them into the aristocracy. Emily Ridgway became the Marquise de Ganay, and it appears to have been her husband, the Marquis, who oversaw the management of the Ridgway collection and sold the suite to Reginald Vale, a London stockbroker and speculative collector. Vale, in turn, seems to have flipped the set within a year, offering them in his 1903 collection sale at Christie's. There, the 4 pictures were purchased en bloc by the prominent dealer Arthur Tooth, acting as agent for Sir Joseph Robinson. Robinson was a hard man. Born in South Africa, then under British rule, he made his fortune in mineral extraction, opening some of the first diamond mines and gold mines in the colony and plowing the proceeds into a bank. Advancing his business interests through ruthless political and financial maneuvering, he deployed parallel tactics in his quest for social advancement in England, buying his way over widespread objection into a baronetcy and ultimately a peerage. In 1895, he acquired Dudley House in central London, here at Left, and it was no doubt with an eye to furnishing this vast private residence that he acquired the 4 reconstituted cartoons. Convicted of defrauding shareholders in 1921, Robinson retreated to South Africa, selling much of his collection at auction in 1923. The 4 cartoons, however, failed to sell, passing instead to Robinson's daughter, Ida, here at right, whose husband, an Italian count, Natale Labia, at Left, served as Mussolini's ambassador to South Africa. In 1929, he constructed the so-called Casa Labia overlooking the bay outside Cape Town as an ambassadorial residence. The Labias hung the reconstituted cartoons in their dining room, where, as you see in the photograph at left, 2 of them remained until quite recently. Vertumnus and Pomona, too, hung in the Casa Labia until 1967, when heirs of the Dowager Princess Ida consigned highlights from her collection to Park Burnett in New York. The finest of the 4 dining room decorations, Vertumnus and Pomona sold to the California Palace of the Legion of Honor. From Paris to London to Cape Town to San Francisco, the picture has traveled more than 20,000 miles in the nearly 3 centuries since it was painted, morphing from a cartoon into an architectural decoration, and finally a gallery picture. Here to tell us more about the physical transformations this long journey has wrought, and the next act in this painting's life story, is Elise Effmann Clifford.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all? No? Okay. If I get a little closer, is that good? Better, okay. I'll try to project. All right. Excuse me. Now that Emily has introduced our painting, its subject matter, and its history, I want to invite us all to step back for a moment. As curators and conservators, we typically present the finished story to the public in lectures like this. But it is important to remember that it is often years of research and close looking that allow us to arrive at our conclusions. There's a long period of not knowing before we know. And in the next half hour or so, I'm looking forward to sharing that journey with you. Those of you who have been coming to the Legion for a long time will remember Vertumnus and Pomona as we see it here in Gallery 7, where it hung for 18 years from the Legion's reopening in 1995 until it was removed during a refresh of the gallery in 2013. And this is how I first encountered it. I was interning in paintings conservation at the museum in 1995 during the Legion renovation and reopening before I went to graduate school. I vividly remember standing on a ladder to dust it as the museum was preparing for its opening festivities. It was when I returned as a staff conservator in 2007 that I learned that the painting was related to tapestry production. I remember it being hard to believe that an artist would paint a fully conceived canvas painting to use in such a utilitarian way. As I mentioned, Vertumnus and Pomona was deinstalled in 2013 when the gallery was repainted and rehung. At the time, it was decided that the distracting canvas distortions and the visibly discolored retouching made its poor condition stick out from the other works in the gallery, so the painting was taken down to storage, where it lived for the next 5 years. In 2017, Ton Wilmering, who was a program officer for the Getty Foundation, contacted me to get my perspective about a conservation program they were thinking about funding. Ton was reaching out to paintings conservation department heads and other leaders to assess the need and interest in an initiative focused on the structural treatment of paintings on canvas. Structural treatment refers to aspects of a treatment that stabilize a work. So in the case of canvas paintings, it means reducing distortions, repairing tears, lining, securing the tacking edges, and similar things. Through his discussions, he found that there was a general feeling in our community that since our field had moved away from more interventional treatments, that a knowledge gap had formed in which younger and mid-career conservators haven't had many opportunities for hands-on training in lining, tear repair, and other practices. At the end of the call, Ton asked me if I knew of any potential projects in our collection, and I said, why, yes, I do. I described the Boucher to him and how we, it clipped off the rest of my thing. Basically, I described it to him and how it was going to take a long time to do the treatment, so it was hard to manage that. A few months later, we were invited to submit a proposal for that treatment as part of the newly funded Conserving Canvas initiative. And we were thrilled to be chosen as one of the first 5 projects in the spring of 2018. This was such a special educational opportunity since it meant that the project would be a part of a broader conversation happening in our field about the structural treatment of paintings on canvas. It would allow us to have an advanced fellow to work with us for a year and to host 2 workshops focused on the structural treatment that would bring together younger and mid-career conservators with senior mentors. The Boucher project is what we call a full treatment, which entails a first phase of removing the varnish and overpaint, followed by the structural work in the second phase, and a concluding phase in which the losses are retouched. As I walk you through the process, it's important to note that the Getty Foundation grant covered phase 2. The project got underway almost exactly 7 years ago in the fall of 2018. Our first step was to X-radiograph the painting, which had not been done before. This is Desi Dijkma, who at the time was a fellow at SF MoMA and who came to help me with this part of the project. The resulting X-radiograph image allowed us for the very first time to see and understand the painting's structure, which had been covered up by old restoration. This definitively confirmed that the painting is a tapestry cartoon. The line obscured by restoration paint to the left of center was actually a cut. When we looked at the painting and its X-radiograph with former curator at the Getty and tapestry specialist Charissa Bremer-David, she was particularly excited to see this arced part of the cut, which goes around Vertumnus's hand. She said that it's exactly what one would expect to see on a cartoon. Tapestry weavers specialized in different parts of the design, such as the foliage and the drapery, and this would allow the weaver working on the figure to complete the hand before moving on to the next strip or band of the cartoon. It also clarified that the bottom section was made up of 4 smaller canvas pieces. The X-radiograph importantly helped us to better understand the painting's relationship to the 2 known existing tapestries, the one in the center, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the one on the right from a private collection. And you'll notice that in addition to the elongated lower section of our painting, that the 2 tapestries are wider in format than the painted cartoon. As the low warp weaving process used by Beauvais reverses the image as it is woven, I've horizontally flipped the tapestry images in Photoshop to aid in our visual reading of the composition. The vertical light-colored lines show how our painting is the 2 center bands. It was originally an even wider painting before it was cut into strips. Unfortunately, we do not know where the 2 outer strips of the painting ended up, although, since they are not central to the composition, it's likely that they were repurposed for something else or possibly discarded altogether. Our first big treatment step was to clean the varnish. This means removing the old and discolored varnish as well as restorer's overpaint. This part of the process was led by our conservator Tricia O'Regan, pictured here. This was a stage that took many months and was completed by the summer of 2019. And this image gives a clearer view of how discolored the varnish was, and also how fresh the colors appear where it's been removed. And here's our painting after cleaning. You are seeing it without the discolored varnish and with all the old losses exposed. The damages visible around the perimeter of each band and the other straight lines of loss are all likely originated from its use as a cartoon under the loom, and also from the 50 or so years that the strips were stored by Beauvais and likely rolled. You can also clearly see how different the bottom section now appears from the main part of the painting. The paint in this area is highly soluble, as it is from the same campaign of overpaint that's on the rest of the painting. And this is with the top section cleaned. We took tiny samples of paint and mounted them in resin so that we could look at them as cross-sections. This allows us to see the sequence of the layers of the ground and the paint, basically like a slice of layer cake. It was clear that all of the samples share the same double ground structure, which was applied as the base for the successive paint layers. This is the lower orangey red ground, followed by a beige colored layer. However, this upper second ground differs between the two samples from the main body of the painting, the top two, and those in the lower section, which is the bottom two. The lighter color was used in the main part of the painting, and a darker beige was used in the lower sections. And this indicates that although the bottom section appears to be made from similar bits of tapestry cartoons, that they are not from the now missing left or right sections of our cartoon. And as Emily has previously shown, the reason for this addition was to bump up Vertumnus and Pomona to the same level as the figures in Love's Offering, Evening, and the Love Letter, which had joined in the 19th century to form a decorative suite. So what do we do now that the bottom edition is no longer integrated with a cleaned painting? We met with our director, Tom Campbell, who of course is a tapestry specialist himself, and our colleagues in European art, and this was actually before Emily joined our staff, and we discussed what to do next. Because the lower section was not original to the painting and could not be aesthetically reintegrated with it, we decided that it actually needed to be removed for us to be able to once again exhibit the painting. We also resolved to save and archive the strip as an important part of the painting's history. Removing the bottom section would require removing the painting from the stretcher. In thinking through the next steps of the treatment, we focused on the fact that sections of the painting had been folded onto the back of the stretcher along the top and bottom at some point in its history. We realized that we had the valuable opportunity to reclaim the original portion of the painting that had been folded over onto the top. So we would be losing about 10.5 inches at the bottom while gaining 6 inches at the top. So an overall dimensional change of about 4.5 inches in height. Phase 2 kicked off in September 2019 with a new addition to our team. Kat Harada, here in green, joined us for a 1-year Getty Foundation Fellowship, fresh from her fellowship at the Moritz House in The Hague. Working closely with our associate conservator, Sarah Kleiner, here in white sleeves, they tackled planning the next structural steps. After stabilizing paint around the edges, at the end of 2019, we worked with our museum technicians to place the painting face down on the table. And this is Kat working to relax the very stiff canvas folded over the back so that we could safely remove the stretcher, which we were finally able to do. The folded over sections were still quite curled and stiff, so Sarah and Kat worked to further relax them back into plane. Oops. And here you see both the reverse and front views once the painting was fully flat. The line you see running down the center of the reverse is the seam for the lining canvas. A lining is a secondary piece of fabric that is adhered to the original canvas, most typically as part of a later restoration to strengthen the canvas and to reduce distortions. When Vertumnus and Pomona was put back together, it was lined to another piece of linen fabric with glue paste. Remember that the original painting was even wider than this, and such a wide size of linen simply wasn't readily available in the 19th century, so two pieces were seamed together. With the painting fully extended, with the sections that had been folded over newly visible on the face, other parts of the painting's history came into focus. When Dorothy Mann, conservator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and one of our senior advisors, visited us in January 2020, we were puzzling over the semicircular cutouts in the corners. We had wondered if they had something to do with the painting's life in an architectural setting, but it was also seemed possible that they were cut out to aid in stretching on the stretcher to get rid of excess fabric in the corners. And just as an aside, Dorothy was an important mentor to both myself and Sarah early in our careers, and so it's particularly special to work with her again on this project. An answer to the corner shape came when Dorothy noticed lines of gilding just in from one of the semicircular cuts in the corners. This indicates that the extended format with these cutouts dates from when the painting was in an architectural decoration in the 19th century Parisian mansion, inset into the wall with framing overlaid on the surface. The shorter frame format that we have enjoyed in our collection dates from when the painting was removed from the house and repurposed as a gallery picture, likely at the end of the century. After the top and bottom were flattened, Sarah and Kat undertook the big step of removing the bottom section. I want to again underscore that this is something that we did only after deep ethical and philosophical discussions with our curatorial colleagues and among ourselves, and that we have saved and archived the bottom section. And this was on Wednesday, March 11th, 2020. On March 13th, 2020, we closed the museum due to the COVID pandemic. Over that summer, we were able to inch back to work. The focus was then on flattening the distortions on the top edge fold over. And this is Kat working with a special heated tool with a section of the painting placed over a suction platen to help draw the canvas into plane. And this image shows the great results that we were able to achieve. However, work was dramatically slowed, and we couldn't make plans for our Getty-funded workshops until vaccines became available and as the trajectory of the pandemic became clearer. One important thing that I was able to do while working from home was to date the lining. The lining of our painting was clearly from the 19th century when the painting was put back together, but we didn't know if this was done before it was sold from Beauvais in 1829, or right after, or decades later. The one piece of information that I had to go on was the bits of newspaper that were used on the lining that remained along the right edge of the tacking margin. On Emily's advice, I took the content of some of the newspaper bits and input them into Gallica, which is a digital repository for the Bibliothèque nationale de France, which utilizes optical character recognition for searching in their newspapers. And I can't tell you how thrilling it was to find a match. This indicates that our painting was lined sometime after April 1846. Another thing that we were able to work on was making canvas inserts to bridge the areas of loss to the fabric. This is one made for the corners. And for those of you who are looking really closely, the images to the left are just to show the process, and it's not the same insert as the piece that's on the right. And here in the image on the right shows the inserts in place along some of the tacking holes along the top. And a very bright spot in the slowdown was that Emily Beeny was hired as our curator in charge of European paintings in the summer of 2021. And this appointment finally meant that we had a key curatorial partner in place to guide the important decisions that had to be made. So, to turn back to our painting, which is on the table without a stretcher, we have removed the bottom section, which has shortened the height by 10.5 inches, at the same time reclaiming the top portion that had been folded over the back, which has added 6. The difference now is that the painting is 4.5 inches shorter than it had been. So how do we deal with this change in format? One approach would be to restretch the painting on its stretcher as is, so that there is a 2.5-inch margin of canvas on both the top and bottom that could be framed out with a wide liner. The painting would essentially be floating within the stretcher with a wide fabric margin on both the top and bottom. The other option would be to modify the stretcher and frame by cutting them down to fit the new format of the painting. This would permanently alter those elements of the structure, so not a decision to take lightly. This really became a question of which part of the painting's history do we prioritize? Do we prioritize its life as a tapestry cartoon? Do we prioritize its life in the architectural setting? Or do we prioritize its most recent history as a gallery picture? Because this is a high-profile painting in our collection and well-known to both Boucher and tapestry scholars, we hosted a conversation on Zoom about the history of the painting and our question of what to prioritize in its final presentation. And this is a slide that we used for that conversation. At the end, we asked our participants to raise their hands for one of the two choices, either cutting down the stretcher and frame to prioritize its life as a gallery picture, as you can see on the left, or to leave the stretcher and frame as is to prioritize its earlier history, as illustrated in the image in the center. The opinions were quite evenly split, with painting specialists favoring the former and tapestry specialists generally the latter. In a follow-up in-house meeting, we got together as curators and conservators and decided that the interventional and irreversible path of cutting down the stretcher and frame was actually the one that made the most sense for the painting now that it is a permanent part of our collection. While it has lived many lives, it is now a museum gallery picture. And this is our talented woodworker, Arlo Valera, from our technical production team, working with Natasha Morovich, who's our frames and gilded surfaces conservator. Arlo collaborated with Alan Miller, panel paintings conservators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to cut down the stretcher. Arlo was able to do most of this by talking through the process with Alan virtually, and then Alan flew out here for the final work to ensure that the stretcher was structurally sound. By the fall of 2021, we were finally able to start re-envisioning the planning of our Getty Foundation-funded workshops in the spring of 2022. We set the date of a week in March to restretch the painting with our project advisor, Dorothy Mann from the Met, and then another week in April to focus on filling and texturing canvas losses with Mark Tucker from the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Rod Proctor, conservator in private practice in Houston. And I should say that the gentleman who is to the right of Rob is Frank Zuccari, who sadly passed away that summer. And also for the workshops, we were also joined by a wonderfully engaged group of younger and mid-career conservators. For the first workshop, Sarah and I were joined by Dorothy, Lauren, Kat, and Sophie. You may be curious about how we get a big canvas painting back on its stretcher and upright again. To restretch, we need to add fabric to the edges, which is called an edge lining. I had prepared strips of fabric in advance of the workshop, cutting them, fringing the edges, sizing them, and then rolling out a special heat-activated adhesive onto them. Our first couple of days of our workshop focused on talking through the project and the edge lining, adhering the edges to the painting and making sure that they were well attached. We were then able to reposition the newly cut down stretcher. And then we worked with Dorothy to restretch the painting and attach it with tacks. After lunch that Friday, our technicians raised it off the table and put it on the easel. And I can't tell you how amazing it felt for us to have the painting upright again after 2 years off its stretcher. Sarah broke open the champagne. I was pretty exhausted, and I think Kat's expression in the center captures all the feelings of achievement. For the second workshop, Sarah and I were joined by Mark, Rob, Lauren, Rachel, Kat, Kari, and Sophie. Here we gathered to talk about and learn techniques for repairing canvas tears and for texturing fills on canvas losses with Mark and Rob. We talked about how these techniques could be applied to the Boucher, but also had the opportunity to just play around with materials on mock-up paintings. And then we put what we had learned into practice. We had decided in discussions with Emily and her team that we would retouch the cutout corners so that they would be visually reintegrated with a picture. Successful retouching can often depend on the underlying texture of the filled loss. Mark taught us a technique for casting a silicone mold off the surface, which you see me doing here. And it may be startling to see me pour silicone directly onto the painting, but the surface is isolated with a layer of varnish that we then removed after the casts were made, and I can assure you that this was completely safe for the painting. And you can see the resulting silicone mold to the right with a canvas weave impression. The next step was to spread a very thin layer of pigmented epoxy over the mold, and the image on the right shows the resulting textured epoxy film after it had cured. A template was then made from the loss and transferred to the epoxy film and cut, and then adhered to the corner. And then this was also done to the opposite corner. We also spent time texturing the many, many small losses along the top edge. And this is Isaac Messina, who joined our staff as an assistant conservator in the end of 2022, and Josephine Wren, who was our graduate intern from 2023 to 24. And as we neared the end of the structural phase, we also spent time on fine-tuning our cleaning. We removed old chalk fill where it had covered bits of the original painting. This was a time-consuming process, but it was really satisfying as we recovered important information about the composition. In the spring last year, Alan Miller joined us again from the Met to work with Arlo and Natasha to cut down the frame. And Natasha will be focused later this fall on consolidating and regilding the losses. And finally, in January 2024, all of the cleaning, filling, and structural work was completed, and we brushed on a layer of varnish. Yeah. I'll let it run just for a little bit. The varnish is an important aspect of old master paintings. It provides saturation to the paint and evens out the surface. It also provides an isolating layer from our retouching, which is the, okay, that might have, yeah. There was a chance that was gonna happen, but we actually got to see it, so that's all just fine. Let me reopen, this one here. Oh, wait, I just wanna make sure. Oh, sorry, I just have to check that this is the correct version. Sorry about that, I've got it under control, but just your patience. Your patience. Okay, I just needed to make sure this, okay. Let's see, now I have to get onto the right slide, and I won't run the video is almost over, so you're not missing anything. Perfect. And so that whole process took about 12 minutes, condensed. And these images highlight the big difference both in saturation and in gloss that a varnish can make. This is the painting varnished and before we began retouching, which began a year ago in February. Isaac, Tricia, and I have spent countless hours retouching the painting since then. With retouching, we are using conservation-grade paints in a synthetic medium, which has been developed to not discolor or fade, and also to continue to be easily removable in the future. As you can see, there are many, many small losses in this image. These are fairly straightforward to match the surrounding paint, but they do take time, and this represents many, many days of Isaac's work to arrive at this very satisfying result. But there are also much larger areas of loss, areas that are completely devoid of compositional clues, such as along the right side, the top corners, and the arced area where Vertumnus' right hand should be. How do we deal with large areas of loss like this? Our guiding principle is to be as true and authentic to the artist's original intentions as possible. This means that we look to other versions or similar works by the artist, or perhaps an engraving after the painting, so that we are basing our reconstruction on something real. This is something that I gained a lot of experience with when I was starting out my career as a fellow working with Mark in Philadelphia, and we invited him back out here to spend a couple of days in the studio to get us going. For our painting, we are incredibly fortunate to have two known existing versions of the tapestry that were made directly from our cartoon. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, which owns the earliest produced tapestry, generously rephotographed it for us in very high resolution. We then scaled the digital image to life size and printed out the missing sections. The composition is then outlined on Mylar and then transferred with carbon paper onto the painting. And this shows the retouching of this area in process. And now, just to remind you where we started in February 2024. And this is the painting as it was photographed this past Tuesday. So we've come a long way, and we still have months of work to go. We will be reintegrating the top corners, reconstructing Vertumnus's hand, and retouching the many losses along the top, as well as finishing our work on the other areas. When I earlier spoke of prioritizing Vertumnus and Pomona's history as a gallery picture, I actually believe we have achieved presenting all three stages of the painting's life simultaneously. No longer confused by the addition and overpaint added for its second life in the dining room, the painting is now what remains of the original. At the same time, that second life can be seen in the upper corners with the semicircular cutouts that will remain subtly visible. Its first life as a tapestry cartoon, too, is now easier to understand, as we are reconstructing the lost elements directly from the Met's tapestry. Now that the full width of the right strip can be understood with its stone pedestal topped by a vase with a satyr's face, which now looks out from the far right side. This has been a story of the past 7 years, which is a long time to work on one project. But it wasn't just this one project that had our focus. This is just a sampling of other major paintings treatments that have occupied our time over the same period, many with their own deadlines and their own stories. But it is actually this extra time that we had due to the COVID pandemic and having deadlines on other projects that has made the outcome so successful. It was this extra time that brought all of these bits of information into focus to form the story that we've been able to share with you today. The project benefited immeasurably from the expertise and collaboration of many people. And through the work, we have become our own chapter in the painting's history. I wanted to share this sort of Easter egg with you. We actually signed the interior side of the stretcher before the painting was restretched. The signatures face inwards, so will only be visible when and if the painting is removed from the stretcher again, perhaps centuries from now. I did pause for a moment before deciding I wanted to include this in our lecture, since we did permanently add our names to this 19th century stretcher, which could be questioned since we did alter an original element of the painting. However, I felt that it is important that our names be there, hidden behind the painting. When we began the project, we had many questions, many of which we have been finally able to answer. But I do always wonder about the people that did the work. The studio assistants laying in the sky and perhaps painting those velvety peaches. The person who sliced the finished painting into 4 pieces. The weavers who spent countless hours bent over the loom with the strips of our painting visible through the threads. The people who pulled the rolled cartoon fragments out of storage in Beauvais and prepared them for sale. The liners who put our painting back together again. The decorators who helped install the painting to adorn the dining room of the house of an American couple who married their daughter to the son of a marquis. The art handlers and shippers who moved the painting to London after it was stretched and framed at the end of the 19th century. And those who organized its transit a decade or so later to South Africa. I think it was all those individuals lost to history that made me feel the urge to physically add our names to it. And thank you.
So we're going to sit down on stage and answer any questions you all might have. Just give us a moment. Does this look about right? Does this look about right?
can you hear me? No. Yes? Okay. Okay. So the question pertained to the discoloration in a varnish, and if artists, knowing that a varnish discolors, actually altered their painting practices to address that. Is that the question? Yeah. Essentially? That's a big question. So it was understood that varnishes did discolor to some degree. Oh God, that's just like a big question. Oh gosh. I don't even know how to answer that. I mean, it's just such a huge, because there are many different centuries and different approaches. So some artists, like say in the 19th century, were actually going for a discolored varnish look to sort of imitate 17th century practices of like Rembrandt. So I would say for the most part, an 18th century French artist like Boucher was not altering his practice with the idea that a varnish would discolor. It was sort of known that a varnish would eventually be removed and cleaned. So it would be more the trying to just have really stable like painting practice so that could, the paint would be, would not be damaged.
Can I maybe add, just to direct people up to our galleries after this discussion? You can see some of these different approaches from different centuries, certainly on view in our collection. So for examples of 18th century artists sort of patinating their pictures to make them look as though they were old master paintings already, layering in color actually with the varnish to make the varnishes seem pre-aged. Look for our Gainsborough, and look for our Fragonard, the Education of the Virgin. Those are, or not the Education of the Virgin, the Virgin and Child, the sort of duchy-looking one. Those are great examples of that. And after Rembrandt, exactly. And then conversely, if you go to our Impressionist gallery, you can see pictures that were never intended to be varnished, paintings that sort of post-date the taste for varnish in a way. So the question has to do with whether there was also an additional strip of canvas at some point at the top of our picture, and I think the answer is no. I think maybe part of what you're gesturing to is the relationship with the other three from the set of four, and I think a useful thing to remember about our picture's relationship to those three other canvases is that it's not particularly organic. These were a group of things that happened to be in a pile sold out of Beauvais in 1829 that seemed like they could be made to go together. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that the formats would originally have looked more similar than they end up looking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and actually the current height as it is now, although we have regained some, there's still there is a section that's missing that just was cut off completely when it was lined. So if you look at the tapestry, there are a few more inches that would have existed on our painting, but those are gone. So we have now all we can kind of get back from it. Yes. So yes, and actually with Beauvais, there are record books that actually tell you how wide those were created, and you can sort of measure, and we actually have, so we kind of know what those would have been. I don't remember offhand. The one thing with fabric, though, is the dimensions are a little, yeah, it's not as set as a canvas painting, but we do sort of know about. I mean, the two center sections were the largest sections. The two side ones were a little bit narrower, but it also does have to do with weaving how far a person could actually work. So there was sort of a limit to what that width would be. Yeah, for each strip.
And Elise, is it accurate to say that basically the idea is one-to-one in terms of the dimension of the painting to the woven dimension? I'll do my best to repeat the question with a mic. Obviously, it's so helpful to have the Metropolitan Museum tapestry as a guideline for laying in the design. But of course, what the actual painted surface looks like, the original is lost to us. And so I think that Jeff is hoping you can talk a little bit about the kind of how you go about evoking the touch of Boucher and the members of his workshop as you are retouching.
That is a wonderful question. And something I've thought a lot about seated in front of the painting. So part of it is just really trying to be, a lot of it is just really being accurate, trying to be accurate to what is missing. That information of physically, like those leaves, those flowers, that pedestal. And so to block it in, if you saw it with the detail that I was showing, I've been sort of working in a very vertical kind of way, which is just very helpful in just sort of sorting out in a sort of methodical, systematic way what we're putting back. There are many different approaches that people could take. I am not Boucher, and I am, for me, the way I'm approaching it, I think if our viewer any viewer in the gallery will be able to go up to see it, and it will be visible that it is a later restoration, but when you stand back, it will read together as a whole. So that's sort of what I'm going for, that it's not going to be particularly noticeable unless you want to notice it. So I am trying to be much more accurate with like the colors and the distribution of the way the light is hitting things, rather than the actual trying to create the brushwork of Boucher. So it's something that's more imitative in an overall sort of compositional and coloristic way than anything having to do with like brushwork.